Welcome back to this Test Modeler 101 series. In this video, we're going to start talking about advanced test coverage and negative testing. It's important to think about modeling in a way that allows you to open up different ways of getting the most out of your test cases. Models force you to think about different scenarios, not just positive ones. We typically see quite linear models when people start modeling because they just think about positive or happy scenarios. Usually, that's a linear model. For us, we want to start thinking about negative testing and negative scenarios to help us widen our coverage when it comes to different types of testing. It's also important to start understanding the different ways that we can improve our test suite when it comes to the coverage metrics and the different targets that we can apply when getting into path optimization. As part of this video, we're going to walk all through that. Okay, so we're inside Test Modeler, and we're going to come and look under our Fun with Coverage section. So what we typically see is when people start modeling, we go and create a new model, and we'll just, just call this one login. We generally see that it's quite happy path sort of ideas, right? So to start to think a little bit outside the box when it comes to generating your tests, because you're thinking about all the different journeys you could go on. So a typical, so let's just say a typical login. We've got a username, we have a password, and then what else? Maybe we go and click submit. Click submit, and maybe that's kind of where the brain goes, right? So it's just quite a straightforward idea, and then people might start doing some more exploratory testing and clicking around on screens and so on and so forth. But the documentation is sort of pretty static at this point. What we want to do when modeling is start to think of some of the negatives, right? So rather than just think username that works, maybe we just go for type in the right space. Maybe we go for invalid username, right? And then we've got a decision to make. So we can start to put in certain conditions, and the conditions can help us choose the paths that we go on. And this condition maybe is valid username. And we can then do the same, of course, for our passwords, right? So, and we can tie these guys up and so on and so forth. So what, in quite a small space of time, I've been able to do is just start to introduce so everyone's kind of aware the different types of things that we can start to think about, and it's not all just happy, but actually there is some other scenarios that could potentially occur here, right? So let's get this looking nice and tidy like so. And what we encourage people to do is start to think a little bit about the positives and the negatives that sort of can occur, and decide whether you model it so that the model enforces it entirely, so that you have separate lines and separate strings, or you tie them together, and then we start to use our coverage profiles to help you figure out what tests you actually want to go and run. So let's just go and look at something a bit more complex. Let's go and look at, say, this invoicing system here. This particular invoicing system, a bit more complex than the login flow, but we're calculating some invoices. We're going through, depending on where we are in our date, right? It's at the end of the month. Whereabouts are we? And then we're going to go and decide what we're going and doing. And in the middle here, there's actually a subflow that's also running. So there's a bit of complexity here, right? We're starting to think about categories, adding, deletion. Do we want to do anything? Do we not? Etc. etc. So when we look at this, we're going to have a series of tests that we can run. So there's 11 tests to get through this particular process. And as I click through these, we can see these tests as they sort of exist, right? So from this subflow, we can see the flows and so on and so forth. Which is great, but we may want to run every test. This might be an incredibly important sort of section that we want to have a look at. It might not be. So what we have here is a few different profiles. So I've got my minimum profile here, and I'll just generate these tests from fresh, and it shows us that we've got 6 paths. So these 6 paths are going to run through each of the nodes that exist here, right? So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 to cover the majority of scenarios. Now, there's various decisions you've got to make when testing in terms of the amount of time you've got, the amount of complexity something is, the amount of knowledge you have on that sort of system, so on and so forth. So the coverage profiles are a good way of being able to understand potentially how many tests you could run. So if we go and have a look at, say, everything here, we've actually got 54. So let's generate those again, just make sure we've not changed anything. Yeah, 54 paths. So if you want to fully cover every scenario that's represented in the model, you've got a variety of different steps and different tests to kind of run through. So let's have a look at this thing. 7 steps, for example, reasonably straightforward. We do look at something slightly more complex, and so on and so on. So coverage profiles are a really good way of being able to change how Test Modeler and its algorithm pulling out the tests that you should go and run. What you can do is then, of course, set up your own profiles. So if you wanted to, for example, search across that particular model for everything that's tagged with valid or invalid data, for example, you could go and create a coverage profile that allows you to, I guess, either in this case exhaustively or maybe even ignore. So if there's certain blocks, certain bits of logic you're not interested in, you can use tags and these profiles as a way to be able to control all of those different narratives. So as part of this, I would recommend you come in, create your own coverage profile, see the difference between exhaustive, high, medium, and low, and see the different results that you get. Just make sure you're doing it on a reasonably complex model so that you can see the impact and actually how something that's quite sturdy, quite large, 54 tests is nothing to be nothing to ignore in terms of time to get through those sort of things, can change depending on the profile that you're using.